Hello and welcome to a fuller understanding on the Auto Limits channel. I'm your host Craig Ennis, and I'm joined as ever by my co-host Robert Beams. How are you, Robert Beams?
I'm all right, Craig Guinness. And how are you today on this fine whatever month it is, Morn? September.
I'm feeling good. Yeah, I'm back in the classroom tomorrow for the first time in person since March 2020. So it's going to be a bit of a strange day, but
Interesting.
yeah.
So
But
what are we
looking
talking
forward to it.
about this time?
Well, today we have got. Let me just turn my phone off to silent because I should have done that before we started. Today on episode 5, we are unsurprisingly looking at Sam Fuller's fifth film, Park Row, which is a sort of not quite autobiographical because it obviously happened. It's obviously set years before Sam Fuller's birth, but semi-autobiographical in as much as it's kind of tells about his love and partially about his experiences of working in the newsroom as a young boy. Yeah. Before we start, there was a little bit of an omission from last week's
Oh yeah.
episode, so it kind of nicely ties into it kind of dovetails really nicely into this film. So I'm just going to read a little something from his autobiography, where he talks about being in a screening of Fixed Bayonets with Zanuck, and Zanuck being kind of intrigued by the ricochet scene and not entirely believing that that's how bullets ricochet off walls, basically. So he makes this bet, and Sam Fuller says, 100 cigars says exactly that way. You're on, says Zanuck, looking at the pistol. He's brought a Luger with him to the screening room. It's loaded. I took some real bullets out of a leather pouch on my belt and replaced the blanks in the Luger's clip. Now it is, I said, and I handed the Luger to Darrell. All right, he said, chuckling. Let's see. He fired a couple of rounds with the Luger. The bullets went zinging around the cement walls. Bang, bang, bang. The echo long moment. We both started laughing uncontrollably. Lucky neither of us were hit. It was the perfect moment to bring up Park Row again with Darrell. So yeah,
So
that's where
he
we.
carries a gun around with him is the main thing I'm taking from this.
Yeah, well, much like Sam Peckinpah's reputation, he talks about using it to cue actors. So instead of shouting action, he would fire his gun off at the start of takes, which you
It's
can, which you can only presume isn't the is probably the most disconcerting way to call action.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously he was in the war, as we covered in the first episode. Sometimes people who've been in conflict zones can experience what we now call PTSD and sort of shell shock about hearing even fireworks and things like that. But Fuller carried a gun around and just shot it all the time, so he wasn't bothered by any of that. Interesting. So we've not mentioned this film came out in 1952. As I understand it from the beginning, where a logo, very prominent, very flashy, unusually high production value logo comes up for Sam Fuller Productions at the start. That actually looks quite polished, which in contrast to a lot of the other stuff we see. And so this is him on a kind of a gap from, because you mentioned he brought up Park Row with Zanuck, but he doesn't make this at Fox, does he?
No, he doesn't. So he goes on in his autobiography to talk about pitching this to Zanuck. And Zanuck likes the idea, but he wants it shot in color in cinemascope, with Gregory Peck in the lead and possibly Ava Gardner, and he wants to turn it into a musical as well.
Okay.
And Sam Fuller is like, no, that's not the film I've got in my head. This is my film. That's not what this is. And I mentioned before, in his Fox contract, he was contracted 26 weeks out of the year to be working for Fox on Fox projects, but he was free to spend the other 26 weeks of the year doing whatever the hell he wanted. He didn't have to take any scripts or anything to Fox. They didn't have any first refusal rights or any kind of claim on anything that he wrote. So basically, he's got this script or this idea for a script that he's been working on, and he doesn't like the way that Fox want to take it. So he goes, well, bollocks to it. I'm just going to pay for it myself and make it the way I want to make it. So this film actually has a third of the budget of Fixed Bayonets.
Wow.
It was made for $200,000.
According to, obviously, the only source I'm going on here is Wikipedia, but the kind of production fact they have about this film, which they're getting from the IMDb, I think, is that half the budget was spent on the set, which I can believe, because it's quite a good set. I mean, you can see it's a set, and there are bits at the end of the street, so you can clearly see like just a big painting of like other stuff. But it's pretty, as Sam Fuller films go, this set looks pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, you do pick up on a few of the forced perspective models going down the street. It's essentially, I mean, it's Park Row with a few things going off it.
Yeah,
but it's an impressive looking set. They built some of the buildings sort of 4 stories high. There's an impressive number of extras on the streets as well in period costume. Like the streets look genuinely busy, and you've got the horse and carts going by.
And sometimes, because I get the impression he just kind of does one take and isn't that meticulous, there are some times when the extras are kind of clearly stopped and then they start walking as they come into the frame, which is quite nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a bit sloppy. And even with this extra money, he's still well, I know he's not got extra money here, but I mean, on top of what he started out with on his first films, he's still just doing those optical zooms, isn't he? Rather than actually planning to zoom on people in the shoot.
There's a couple of, I mean, we'll talk more about some of the camera work later, because there is some really interesting development to his camera work in this. But I think maybe it's time for you to talk us through the plot, really.
So it begins with a very earnest dedication. This is kind of, in some ways, a kind of like proto Sorkin, isn't it? It kind of feels like it could be something like that. And it starts with this very earnest dedication to, I guess, just newspapers and newspaper men, which you'd expect from his background. We talked in the first episode about him having been a newspaper man, having come up on newspapers and loving that world. And it starts with a list of what it claims to be every single newspaper operating then in the US. I imagine that list is about a 16th of the length today of that. But at the time, it's got all these local newspapers and all that. And it's a dedication to all of them. And after that, we open on, you talked about his kind of developments and his technique and everything. And we open on a pretty cool crane shot of this set that actually looks pretty good. And we get sort of a tracking shot and stuff from this crane, I think. But basically, the story is we get Phineas Mitchell, who is it Phineas Mitchell? Is that the name of the character that Gene Evans is playing?
Yeah. A slimmed down Gene Evans.
Yeah. So Gene Evans, who in Fixed Bayonets and in Steel Helmet plays basically the same character, he's pretty different in this, actually. And he's playing a very different kind of fast talking kind of character. He still, as we'll get to later, has a kind of action scenes later on, which is kind of okay, but he's playing a very different kind of character. He's kind of fast talking. The dialogue, that there's still a tendency for people to kind of be quite unnatural and start monologuing this sort of stuff, but the dialogue's a lot snappier and a lot better than I think in the previous films. Definitely. We get basically we get Gene Evans he's disgusted because the newspaper that he's working for is basically, he sees them as responsible for this guy having been hung, and this kind of yellow press thing where they're kind of not real news and they're not out for kind of doing the job the right way. So he decides that he gets fired because he confronts his boss, the publisher, the owner, who is a lady, which comes into it quite a few times because people like to tell her how to dress and
what's that?
Can I bring one of the blankets?
Of course you can.
Thank you.
So she's a lady newspaper person who fires him because he's like, I hate your newspaper and the way you do news, and she fires him and a bunch of other people. And
I like that scene. I like that scene where she goes, "What's your name?" And he goes, "Phineas Mitchell." "What paper do you work for?" And she goes, "We don't have anyone called Phineas Mitchell on staff." And then she goes down the room saying, "Oh, we don't have anyone on staff." And then they get to the cartoonist. They say, "Who's this?" And they go, I can't remember the character's name, but blah blah blah, cartoonist. He's unemployed. There was some nice little kind of zingy moments in there.
So she fires everyone, and then he's at the bar kind of going, they're like, what would you do if you had a newspaper? And he starts kind of going, I'd do this and this and this. And so like a random kind of wealthy guy who owns a printing press comes over and gives him a big purple prose speech about, you'll be the heart, I'll be the hands, and all this kind of stuff that he says. And then but basically he lets Gene Evans start his own newspaper. And it could be like when you and a few mates have a few beers and then you say, yeah, we're definitely going to go to Ibiza. Let's do it. Let's book it tomorrow. But they just start printing the paper that night. They get right into it. So
it's brilliant. Because there's this great little bit at the beginning where they start this guy who like, how come I've never been in a newspaper? And they say, well, if you jump off the Brooklyn Bridge, you'll get into a newspaper. And they kind of convince him to do it. And then he goes and does it. And he comes back wet, and then the police come in saying that's illegal, and then Gene Evans sells him out in order to be able to print the story. Basically.
I want to come back to. I was kind of doing the rundown, but let's go into this now because I thought this kind of undermined a lot of the film. Because the thing is that he's going, oh, this newspaper got this man killed, they got this man hung, while him and his buddies are edging a guy on to commit suicide for a gag, basically, because they think he's going to die. You usually die if you jump off the bridge, which is why it's a story when he doesn't. So it seems strange that that's kind of a thing he's doing while lambasting this publisher for getting a guy killed. It's very odds with itself, I think, there. And also, as I'll come on to more later, it talks a good Sorkin-esque game about the principles of this newspaper man, but we don't see him tackle slumlords or racial segregation or anything. We see him tackle guy who jumps off bridge because we asked him to, and it filmed to suggest his newspaper's printing anything that's to do with like society or real journalism, but they're constantly talking about it like they are.
Well, this is true, but the other thing is, it feels like the whole film takes place over 5 days as well.
That's true.
So it's not like they've had a chance to break many stories.
So, but yeah, most of the stories they break as we go over the film because they kind of end up getting to a war with his former boss's newspaper, which is literally across the street, with kind of violence and stuff ensuing and bombs and explosions and fisticuffs. Most of the stories he prints are directly about how he's being harassed by this other newspaper. And so it basically becomes that he starts a newspaper that solely exists to talk about itself and to say that his former employer is bad. That's the whole job of his newspaper. But anyway, I digress. So he starts a newspaper. He's Mr. Fuller, he liked a foreign man with the funnier accent because he has again in his film, I think this is probably the third or fourth in a row where this has happened. He's got just like, again, like I said in the one for Fixed Bayonets, it's very much like a trope from like Capra type screwball comedies to have these kind of characters, but Fuller just uses them just like in these dramas, and he'll have just this guy who's like, I'm a very simple Italian man, and he's got a guy like that works at the printing press. He's got this kind of cast of characters. He's got this wide-eyed young boy who they're kind of training up to be an apprentice, and it's quite a nice shot where this veteran newspaper reporter is talking about stuff to do with the way the press works and the significance of various things, and you do get this kind of push-in zoom on the kind of face of this boy. But earlier in that same sequence, in that same shot, you get the optical zoom on somebody else's reaction in the background. So I'm kind of like, so on one hand he can do these quite more complex setups and these camera moves, but he's also not afraid to just do something really sloppy and amateurish in the same scene. And it's really weird because he clearly doesn't have to do that.
He's a little bit utilitarian. I think he kind of rushes through things a little bit because I think the production on this was 12 days. So you're right. He doesn't shoot coverage. So if they find a problem in the edit, that's what they do, I think. Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting you bring up Capra. I mean, this is probably something better towards the end, but this does feel like a gruff cigar smoking.
It's a Wonderful Life.
Son of a bitch, God damn it! Version of a Capra. This is like it's like an angry. I know he was young at the time, but it feels like an angry granddad trying to retell something like It's a Wonderful Life.
So basically, like, there are various ups and downs with this paper where the other paper across the road gets involved and kills their horses and destroys their ink and prevents them from having paper and all this. They have lots of trials and tribulations. There's also, running in parallel to this, completely unnecessarily, but I guess because, hey, it's a movie, there's also the suggestion that his former boss, because she's a lady, that there's some sort of romance there, and there's almost like scenes where it suggests like, oh, maybe they're going to get together in the end, which I'm like, you literally just accused this woman of like getting a guy hung. Like, why is there why is there anything here? I don't understand this, but it's a film, so there's some sort of suggestion. And it's weird because I recently watched The Shop Around the Corner, which is the film that famously You've Got Mail is a loose remake of. And it feels like this is more like You've Got Mail than Shop Around the Corner is, because you've got the kind of the big one who's running the big newspaper, like Tom Hanks with his big bookshop, and then they're kind of, which is not a plot element in Shop Around the Corner. So it almost feels like the two things sort of smushed together. But I digress. So they have trials and tribulations running a newspaper. It builds to a crescendo where it looks like they just can't carry on anymore. And then I suppose in the most Capra-esque style imaginable, the woman comes in at the end and goes, actually, I was really moved by all the stuff you've done with your newspaper. And although I've done this list of really horrible things and they are all my fault, I'm going to give you my newspaper and my building, and I'm going to let you do the newspaper from there now. And
yeah, she's kind of well, because what happens is these people that she's kind of employed to sort of sabotage them are constantly taking it too far with violence, or I mean, they throw a grenade through the window and break the printing press at the end. But she actually, in the end, kind of lets them use her printing press to print the edition of the paper that's going to bring her paper down.
Yeah,
which is really, really odd.
But that's basically what happens. But then
Yeah.
I've got lots of notes in between all those stages. So maybe you want to go back to the beginning and sort of start talking about your notes.
Well, I mean, if we get past the bar scene, what I really like is a lot of the stuff that probably kills the story and is the reason why it's so compressed. So I love the kind of the kind of tech and procedural fetishism. So that there's a bit where they're all kind of, this is kind of is it linograph kind of
Linotype, that
Linotype.
machine, or
yeah. So you've got basically like the text being put together with like individual blocks of with individual letters on them that have to be put in a row and then printed with, and they've got these huge kind of boxed desks where you kind of separate the letters out and put them into the different boxes so they can be taken out again, and this huge kind of crate where they just get dumped in unsorted afterwards. So one of the jobs, it's called the hell box, and one of the job is to take the things out and try and put them in the right places so people can access them so they can write the next story. And I love the bit where they're all standing around just kind of at speed sorting these things out, and then the kind of the funny foreign guy with the funny voice who can't read, you see him at this incredible speed just sort of picking these out in order to copy the copy and turn it into newsprint. I'm fully aware that they were just probably putting random things in random boxes, but even so, it gives you a sense of the speed that this must have worked at, and I really like all that. And there's an inventor, tinkerer guy, who's inventing a way of automatically writing the sentences, basically like a weird kind of typewriter. And you keep on going back to him and his little experiments and all the steam and the way that the kind of fetishism of the printing presses. I really love all that stuff.
But also like the very sort of practical thing of, we need to get ink, we need to get paper. Oh, the paper shop's closed. Well, go down to the butcher's and get paper from the butcher's, or go to the gift wrapping shop and get paper. And there's all this stuff about how they're going to get the ink and the paper and stuff, which is again really like practical and tangible and kind of interesting kind of the era. I had a line actually from the bar scene where he's talking about his paper, if he gets to start his own paper, and all the idealism. And it's really like a different era, because they're like, what would you do if you had your own newspaper? And he says, like, the first thing he says is, I'd give away free ice and coal. That's like his opening gambit. That's his opening gambit. Giving away free ice was the headline, was the banner statement there. But But yeah, but yeah, I know what you mean. I enjoy a lot of that practical stuff. I thought that was really cool. It is quite clunky. Like there's lots of bits where they're doing that, and it very much is just them clearly telling the audience because Sam Fuller finds the press and the history of it interesting himself, and he wants to kind of sit around and listen to Grandpa. But it is interesting.
That's what I mean. You know, it does kind of, and there's only 80 odd minutes of this, and that kind of takes up a lot of the story time. But I'm still a sucker for that kind of thing.
Yeah,
complete sucker for that kind of thing. And so I don't mind it really. You know, even if it is clunky and kind of, you know, it's not quite. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but it's not quite the Stanley Kubrick Seafarers Union documentary that we got to see at the cinema for some reason. But yeah, it's close to that sort of, well, little Timmy, this is how this works. kind of thing.
I was looking at my notes. I've written. I've already covered this, but I've written. Rare to see a film about an idealistic newspaper man that starts with him printing shit, and that's what he does here because he starts talking about just this man jumped off this bridge, and that's like his opening story. Usually, it would be this thing, a kind of Citizen Kane-esque or whatever journey where they start off with this real idealism, wanting to bring the system down, and then they just end up becoming the thing they hated. But he's basically the thing he hates from the beginning, and it's never addressed.
It is a campaign to get the guy free, though, in fairness.
But it's the guy that he got in prison so he could get him free.
No, he
like
put
the
idea in his head, but he didn't. You know, the guy jumped off the bridge himself. You know, it's his free will. He chose to do that.
Yeah, so his idealistic journalism is saying to a drunk bloke, "You should jump off a bridge because you'll get in the paper." Then, when he turns up, going, "Officer, arrest this man," and then writing stories to get the man free, and that's how this guy begins his idealistic newspaper. He's a complete cad. It's very strange because you'd think, especially because Fuller seems to have had quite a lot of a kind of a social conscience as well. You'd think that it would. That the easy story is like he goes after the slumlords or he goes after some big thing. I guess they didn't want to. I guess they kind of keep it because the whole thing becomes about this relationship between him and this other newspaper. I guess they tried to keep it really light in terms of the other topics in the outside world because they've mostly focused just on this war between the two papers, don't they? As we go into
it. I think so.
So there's some brilliant dialogue in this film, as there always is in Sam Fuller films. There's a bit where the woman, the newspaper woman, says, as people do, as humans talk, she says when she sees this new newspaper's opened up, she says, "Tell me something about the stallion bristling with news." about this stallion bristling with news. That's how she's talking about Gene Evans.
Yeah, that's Mary Welch playing Charity Hackett. Is her name.
So yeah, no, I've kind of my next thing is just why is the woman who got this guy hung the love interest? I mean, where did you come down on that aspect? I feel like I can't remember exactly where. Maybe in the Jesse James one, or I feel like he kind of shoehorns love interests into things where they're not really needed or served in any particular way. I think in Jesse James and in The Baron of Arizona, they both kind of suffer a little bit from him focusing too much on a romance story where the other stuff's more interesting.
I think there's not been many great women characters in Sam Fuller's films yet. There are some films later in his career that we'll get to that are much more interested in exploring the lives of women. But yeah, I mean, she's a love interest because she's the only female character apart from the barmaid who makes flaming drinks to distract people. But to be honest, like when the first kiss they have, which is about I don't know, about 50 minutes into it or so, when I start chatting, I was slightly distracted for it when that was, I think something beeped on my phone or something. I looked back at the screen and I just assumed it was a different character to begin with. And I was like, oh, wait, what's going? Yeah, because it kind of comes out of nowhere. And it is undeserved.
I mean, I thought as soon as she turned up, she was going to be the love interest, even though she was being set up as the bad guy because she was a woman. Therefore, he would love her and she would love him by the end.
I think
and that is kind of how it
his
went.
true love is the truth and the integrity of the press. God damn it! I think. You know.
He's asked by the idealistic old newspaper the old news reporter who he's hired. He's asked how he'd write her obituary, because this guy's like, why are you kind of loving this woman? Like, what would you write in her obituary? And I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says, oh, this woman's dead. She was terrible at newspapers and I fucking hated the bitch, but she was so beautiful and she had nice eyes and she has such a nice voice. And he just he ends up spending this whole fake obit just talking about like what she looks like and how she sounds and how she makes him feel as a man. And it's very, very strange. And it doesn't really, I do feel the film is ill served with this, but it's this weird thing you get with Jesse James and Baron of Arizona as well, where you feel like there's baggy things that have been shoehorned in to make it like a movie, but it's also like an 80-minute long movie. So you're sort of like, if you remove this, then it's barely a movie.
Absolutely, yeah. There is that, you know. I mean, he speeds through it. I mean, it's a film that very much wears its heart on its sleeve, and the message of the film is kind of really kind of pushed through by people saying things rather than doing things constantly in these big grandiose speeches about the power and the importance and the duty of the press and what they should stand for. Is it the fourth column or the third column?
Fourth estate, isn't it?
Fourth estate. But like you say, we rarely see them doing any of that. They just try and put each other out of business a little bit.
Yeah, it's weird. I've got a note here about the fact that it was about 30 minutes to go, because I checked, before there was any stakes. Like I wrote 30 minutes to go. What are the stakes? Where is the conflict? And then soon after that, there was some violence and conflict. And I was like, oh, okay, it's turned up. But there's really nothing until then.
Well, I want to talk about this because this is kind of really, this is good. I mean, this is the kind of the riot scene, if you like. So, I mean, one of the things that they do is they promise to print everybody's name in the paper if they donate money to a plinth for the Statue of Liberty. And they give people receipts and they take the money. But then people start coming in saying, where's my name? I've paid, here's my receipt. And they figure out that the rival paper is giving out fake receipts in order to discredit them. And then they kind of deal with that. But then they start busting up newspaper stands, and it's a bit of violence in the street, and there's a bit of Gene Evans fisticuffs. But there's this 90-second unbroken take which takes him out of his office into the street, into another office, back on the street, a few more fights, and then back into his office, where they find out that Rusty, the young lad, has had his legs run over by a cart, and it's completely unbroken. It goes from wides to closes, and it's also handheld. They strapped the camera to the operator, and he ran around with them and followed them around and pushed in and came out, and it's incredibly dynamic, and it's really odd to see that kind of handheld shake in a film of this age. I thought I watched it back again this morning just before we did this podcast, and it's really quite I don't know if it's innovative. I it's difficult to place these things. It's difficult to place these things in film history unless you've seen everything, but it's certainly unusual for this time.
It does stand out.
Really taken by it.
Yeah, it does stand out. Certainly in the context of what we've seen from Sam Fuller, it stands out as well. And it was really interesting. I wrote somewhat facetiously "old boy" just because Gene Evans does suddenly, it goes from a film with no action or suggestions of violence to him walking down the street, just like taking random guys out. Like there's a guy busting up a cart, beat him up, beat this guy up. The guy pushes him on the floor, he like flips up and beats that guy up. And it's very strange that it suddenly goes that way. And then for the rest of the film, there is quite a lot of that, quite a lot of him just like punching a guy or like things being blown up. And the stakes do get much higher, to the point where the newspaper's about to get shut down. But I feel like in a kind of a conventional movie, if this was the studio movie, we would get there earlier, and we'd have more of that. It feels like it kind of all gets loaded at the end, this stuff. It happens.
I agree, because I think, we spent so much time seeing how the printing presses work and all that kind of stuff, that there is and you know, like you say, the stakes of the actual news are quite low, but there is a version of this film that does talk about violence in the streets of New York at the time. I mean, you know, there's references to the Dead Rabbits, which I kind of picked up on as well, which is one of the gangs in Scorsese's Gangs of New York, and famously a very violent gang at the time. So there is violence on the streets at this time, and it could have been something that they leaned into with whatever they were reporting. So it wouldn't necessarily be out of place. It's just in the context of an 80-minute movie with low stakes, it kind of comes out of nowhere. But I think there is a version of this story that is a lot more kind of mean streets and people putting the squeeze on the paper, not just because it's a rival, but because of what they're reporting. And
we also get told at one point that it's not because of him being a rival that the lady's paper's even going after him. She's not going after him because he's this upstart and she's threatened by him as a business, because the veteran reporter says you could go over after the Sun or the Herald or the whatever, but it's just because you love him. You know, so it's very strange the way they relate it all to like this kind of, she's doing it because she loves this man. It's very odd, especially considering I had really high hopes for this film, and I did like it, but I had really high hopes for this film because I know about Fuller from what we talked about, having this background with the press, and I don't feel like I necessarily got the sense in this film that it was being made by an expert in newspapers. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there are elements of that, but I also feel like the bits you're talking about where he shows the process could have been done by anybody who just got an expert in to ask them, how does that work? Like, I don't know how much of this really feels like his lived experience in the same way that I think his war films do. Like, his war films, you definitely feel like his stories and the things he saw and experienced are in there. And I don't know what's in here from his life.
Well, I think you know, if Steel Helmet and the yet to be seen Big Red One are personal experience and retelling of adult kind of experience and life experience, I think this film is about what he felt as a 14-year-old working in these places, and it's kind of
inspired.
Inspired. It's a film about his nostalgia and his love of the world, and it's if anything, it's told too enthusiastically. You know, he is the producer, writer, director, and he doesn't have anybody reining him in or trying to make it a more kind of conventional story or a more accessible story. And I think sort of, you know, let loose at this point where his style's starting to form, but you know, he's only made 4 films. He's not yet, apart from Steel Helmet, you know, he's not proved himself as a kind of master storyteller by any means. So maybe it's just, I think this film comes across as overly enthusiastic and over, a little bit overly sentimental and nostalgic. And I think that could be it. I think it could be to do with the age that he was when he was in this world.
I did feel like if there was any author insert character, it might have been the little boy in the newsroom, because of the fact that his kind of wide-eyed enthusiasm for it, but also because I remember from what you said in the first episode that Fuller really did start at the bottom, right, and kind of grind his way up. And you get that thing with the boy where they're calling him a newspaper devil, is it, or a news devil, or and the idea being because they go into that the hell box where all the letters are and have to sort them out, and that's like the kind of entry-level job. And I did think when I was seeing that, like, is this because this is kind of Fuller's entry point into this world as well? Like he came up from this kind of, maybe, I don't know, but that did feel sort of like, I get what you're saying, that enthusiasm and that nostalgia.
I think, you know, Mitchell is kind of like he's what he saw his mentors and bosses to be. You know, it's that idealistic kind of vision of somebody, that a father figure, if you like, as well, because you know, Sam Fuller's father died at a young age as well, so it's probably all caught up in that. And I think the enthusiasm and the independence, it just means that the film hasn't been reined in where it needs to be, or sharpened where it needs to be, I don't think. But that said, it's really enjoyable. Like, there's you know, it's never a slog or anything, and the characters are fun and the dialogue is zippy, and it's a really enjoyable, swift 83 minutes or whatever it is. You know, it's an entertaining film, and it's probably his best after the Steel Helmet so far. No,
Oh,
that probably is. It is the best.
Yeah, it is. I really liked it. I think I could have. I rarely will say I wish a film was longer. I feel like this could have used another 10-15 minutes at least, like because you do the ending does feel very rushed. The ending feels super rushed because you spend so much time, as you say, talking about this is how the typewriter works or whatever. That by the it is like the last 30 minutes where we start to really get those stakes, and then it is a very sudden 2-minute turnaround for the lady to come in and go, "Oh, you can have my newspaper now," and it ends. It's very weird, and it also ends very abruptly. There's a lot of very abrupt transitions at the end as well, from scene to scene. I mean, did he shoot typically in sequence? Did he, start from the beginning of the movie and go on? Because
that I don't know. I mean, there's very little written about this film. When I was going through the interview book, he tends to sort of people don't tend to ask him about it. And he doesn't tend to talk about it at length, except to say it's the favorite film that he made, and he made it the way he wanted to make it. Even in the Browse, Lisa, I always get it wrong. Yeah, Dombrowski. No, I always get it right and then think I've got it wrong. She kind of talked through mainly what we've been saying, to be honest. She talks about narrative digressions and that kind of thing. And over reverence and that kind of thing. And there's a little bit of kind of film study stuff dissecting it. But in all the stuff I've read, nobody really talks about it much. He dedicates a fair bit of time to it in his autobiography, but it's mainly talking about his intentions. And there's a lot, and it's quite telling that there's a lot of script excerpts in there as well. He's kind of over enthusiastically trying to tell everybody everything. It seems as well that the film itself didn't do brilliantly. He took a bath on it basically, and almost bankrupted him, and he never put his own money into financing a film again after this. So he comes across as a little gun shy in the few times it is brought up, to be honest.
Okay.
But kind of very proud of it. And it has picked up a kind of it's picked up a following by thriller enthusiasts who recognize it for what it is.
Yeah. One thing from the film, from my notes, that I did want to bring up that I thought was really good was Chekhov's beer art was really nice, because you get the only other female character in the film is this barmaid. At the very beginning of the film, some bloke turns up at the bar and says, "Hey, this is how you draw a picture in beer," and then you just completely forget about it. And then towards the end of the film, when she's got these guys in there who are responsible for this the fraud you were talking about with the fake receipts, she serves a guy from the paper a beer that says like "Get Steve" in the phone.
Yeah.
And then the guy goes and gets Steve. So I like that. I like Chekhov's beer art. It was interesting. It was kind of, I had completely forgotten about it, so it was kind of fun to see it come up again.
Yeah. No, there's plenty to be enjoyed in this, and I think it is one that I would actually watch again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked it. Were there any? You mentioned that he talks about his intentions and things in the book. Like, are there any choice excerpts from that, or what was the general, or if not a particular quote, then what was the general overview? Was his sort of grand intention with it?
I mean, like I say, most of the stuff in the book, I didn't pull a lot of quotes from this one because he talks about his intention, and then he just gives the script excerpts. So, like, this is what I wanted to say, and then you read the words that the characters have said about the power of the press and the integrity of the press. So it's a film that wears its heart on its sleeve, and I think the film the story he's trying to tell, and the story that he's trying to tell and the story that he's trying to show, I think are slightly at odds. And that's why it's slightly disappointing, but still very, very charming.
Yeah, I'd go. I think slightly disappointing, but still charming is probably The ultimate review for it, really. And only really disappointing because of my expectations. I think if knowing what it is, I'd possibly enjoy it slightly more on a rewatch. But I think I just had this idea that this was going to be like the steel helmet of his experiences in the press, and it isn't that. It is this kind of hybrid between it being kind of Capra-esque, kind of proto Sorkin, but not as well written. Just kind of people saying the press is important.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But I did enjoy it. I did enjoy it a lot, and I liked the characters and I liked the actors. I thought Gene Evans was really good. I liked the snappy dialogue. I didn't even mind that there's this kind of shoehorned in romance, but it just feels very rushed and abrupt where some of that comes in. But yeah, I liked it. I gave it a 3.5 on Letterboxd.
So what are your preconceptions of the next film that we're moving on to?
What is the next film? None. I don't even know what that is. I'll look at the synopsis on Letterboxd. Have you seen this one?
I believe I have quite a long time ago.
It's in the top row on Letterboxd, so it's clearly one of his most. I mean, it's on Letterboxd. It comes before Steel Helmet and Big Red One and stuff, which sorted by popularity. So it must be a fairly well watched one. In New York City, an insolent pickpocket, Skip McCoy. Okay, we can stop there. Skip McCoy. That's a great name. So I am expecting more of a kind of pulpy, B-movie noirish kind of crime film from that. I don't know what this is.
I think that's what you're going to get. That's what you're going to get.
I think it's in the 80-minute range as well. What does it say here? 80 minutes. Yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Keep them coming, Sam.
Right. Well, I think that's all she wrote for Park Road. We'll see you next time for Pick Up on South Street.
Yeah, thanks for listening and or watching, and we'll look forward to doing it again as we try to come to a fuller